Today on Diksha, we look at why we need hate. As human beings, we are very familiar with our emotions. We learn very early that we have different feelings. We have feelings of happiness and feelings of sadness. We have feelings of joy or accomplishment, and we have feelings of failure and resentment. So we learn early on to identify that we have different ways that we feel in a situation. We have different reactions that we can't really place as being mental or physical, but we know as human beings that we experience different states of emotion. Now, along the process of learning what our emotions are and to identify happiness and sadness and joy and the variety of all the in-betweens, we also begin identifying what we consider to be positive emotion and what we consider to be negative emotion. This is where the ego building process is key in deciding what we consider to be positive or negative. In fact, we can say that it is one of the defining factors of the ego. And defining, not that we use emotions to define our ego or our temperament, but rather the natural way that comes up that we see ourselves will determine what we consider to be positive or negative emotion. So I'm taking the other side, let's say, or I'm looking at it inversely, where normally we say that, well, these things will define the ego. So for example, if I am successful or if I have accumulated wealth, we say that the wealth has given a person ego or made the person egotistical. And so that will lead to arrogance. But what I am saying here is that based on a person's ego is what they will achieve, especially when we put defining factors like wealth or let's say family life or relationships as signs or status symbols for success. So what I'm saying is that it is our ego that determines what we will achieve and what we will have in life. And so it is our ego first, as being a defined object, that will give rise to what we consider to be positive and negative emotions. The key point to this, or the very important point to take away here, is that our ego is formed first over everything else. When we are infants, when we are learning the world, we develop a sense of being, a state of being. And a lot of people believe, or probably it is even, let's say, held as a law of nature. A lot of people believe that we develop our egos later on in life. So for example, in our teenage years, when we become independent somewhat of our parents, when we begin asserting that we would like to achieve things in the world and that we would like to accumulate material objects or successes in the world. So we begin thinking about what we would like. So people believe that the ego is formed at that stage. What I am saying is that the ego is not formed at that point. It is merely an individual is at a certain point in life where the ability to be independent has arrived. But the ego is something that forms, we can say, in the first 3 years of life, way before we are able to articulate what we want and what we desire. The ego is formed merely by observation of our environment, and so we develop an image to ourselves of who we are in relation to our environment. This is why, for example, you will see infants would challenge the authority of their parents by acting, let's say, by throwing tantrums. It is simply a way of finding out where they stand in the world, if they are able to control their parents, or if their parents have control over them, or if there's a mutual understanding of the situation. All these things are developed in the first 3 years of life. When the infant assessing the reactions of those around them can, let's say, put themselves on a map in terms of their social geography. So that is beside the point. The point here is that when we look at feelings is something that, let's say, is sorted out when we are in the first 3 years or the first 5 years of life. Feelings in terms of what is positive and what is negative. Because I will be able to determine as an infant what emotions I can display in order to get a favorable result from my environment, and what emotions that I need to keep in check in order to, let's say, prevent a certain result from happening or to ensure a certain result happening. So infants do this very well. They are very, let's say, smart. They are very intelligent. And so this is where our ego is formed. From that point onwards, we can see where our ability to understand our world, or our ego, utilizes emotions and utilizes emotional reactions in others in order to, acquire possessions. And by possessions, we can mean friendships, relationships, we can mean respect, we can mean adoration, or we can mean envy or disgust, and that people would not like us. So when we are speaking about feelings, it is in context to, the way it relates to the ego. Now, all this, although it sounds like diverging points, all these points, they guide us into where we consider the emotions rather to be positive or negative. And so we as a human being, based on my ego, based on my image that I have of myself, will use what I consider to be positive or negative emotions in order to achieve desired results. So that is the basis of the nature or the point of having emotions. Now we come to the point or the topic of today, which is why our emotions are there in the first place. What is the point of having emotion? Because if I am looking at emotion simply as a standalone result or a reaction that I have to my environment, I will think solely that they are bad and they are good emotions, and that I will try to act and acquire the reactions of good emotions and avoid the reactions of bad emotions. And by reaction, I mean if I act in a certain way or behave in a certain way, there will be a consequence to those around me that they will act a certain way. So that's one way that emotions act in my life. The other way is that, in the same scenario, then I will experience a certain emotion based on the emotions of others. And so this is where we avoid or we try to achieve certain reactions from those around us so that we may feel a certain way in ourselves. So this is normal. This is the norm when it comes to the way we see emotion, the way we perceive emotion, the way we believe we should be emotionally. We achieve a limited understanding of emotion simply based on the way we believe emotions to be, the way we believe the nature of emotions to be. So my point here is that this belief system in emotion is wrong, and that the emotion is a tool utilized by the ego. because the ego has been established first. The ego, or the image that I have of myself, has allowed me to say I desire certain emotion and I will avoid certain emotions. And this ego was formed by my environment, not formed by my environment, but rather I adopted a particular image based on the observations I made in the first 3 years of my life. And so based on my observation, I avoid certain emotions and I embrace certain emotions. Now, on the topic of our ego, I am not going in this episode into the topic of changing our perspective on our environment, but rather the simple topic of today's Diksha is in understanding that our emotion is not a reaction. Our emotions are a choice of action. And we do not see our emotion, generally speaking, we do not see our emotion as being an action, but rather we see it as being a reaction. And because we see it as being a reaction, we give up the ability to control our emotions. We give up our ability to manipulate our emotion. And yes, if I as an individual have the ability to manipulate my own emotions to give me the feelings that I want, then naturally speaking, I will have the ability to manipulate the emotions of others. So that's just a by the way point. But the major point here, or the major take home point, is that our emotions are a choice to us. We have the ability to choose the way we want to feel. And we have the ability to choose the way we want to utilize those feelings. But as long as we think of them as reactions, and as long as we think of them as positive or negative, we will always give up the ability to control our emotion. And of course, this comes from an awareness of self or ego, where, for example, I may have a particular view of myself which is a bit depressive. And so I will see happiness or joy as being a negative emotion. Because, simply put, based on my environment, I may think, there's no point in feeling joy, or there's no point in being happy, because eventually everything, goes wrong, and I will soon become depressed again and sad again. So sadness is the only real emotion, and happiness is, unreal or fake. So there are two ways to look at it. There's the depressive way, and then there's the joyous way. Now, I'm not trying to make it overcomplicated. As I said, today's topic, based on emotion and why we have emotion, is that we use emotion as a way of developing ourselves. We utilize emotion as a tool in order to understand, the way we see the world. But we must realize our image, our own self-image, our ego, is the entity that utilizes emotion as a tool. So if we find ourselves in a situation emotionally, it is not a reaction, although we tend to look at it that way. It is rather an action being carried out by our ego. And so for those of us who wish to, let's say, change or have control over our emotions, who wish to be able to, let's say, stand firmly and enjoy our emotional state, we must look at our ego. We must look at the self-image that we have of the world. And when we can understand this, then we will have greater control over our emotional circumstances. So like always, I'd like to thank you for joining me on Diksha. right here on Sankhya Television, the first Hindu TV station in Trinidad and Tobago, and your number one choice for inspirational, cultural, and spiritual programming.